What's going on, guys? Dare here with Fantasy Football Advice, coming at you with another fantasy football video. Today, it's Saturday, so you know what time it is. It's time to go over the wide receiver starts and sits, where we go through each and every matchup. We'll let you know how the game is expected to pan out, letting you know the projected game total, how that may impact the game script, and how we can expect that to impact the players and the production we should expect from them. If you're only interested in checking in on your wide receivers for this upcoming matchup, I recommend using the timestamps that are in the description box below, going to the matchup with the team that your player's on. I will of course be spending more time on the less obvious starts and sits, for example strong players in poor matchups or subpar players that have really good matchups, and how that would potentially impact our flex start and sit decision. If you own a player like DeAndre Hopkins, Devontae Adams, Calvin Ridley, don't expect me to spend all that much time on that specific matchup, since we already know those players are going to start, and regardless of matchup, we're fitting them into our lineup, so not too much analysis that needs to go into that. But before we do get into the video though, just want to give you guys a quick shout out. This week we reached 100,000 subscribers throughout the week, and now that we're at the weekend, heading into another great weekend of fantasy football, that milestone has now had some time to sink in on me, and I'm just really grateful for all the support you guys have shown us throughout the years. Nick starting the channel back in 2015, me joining the team in 2016, which now looking back on it is over 5 years ago. The time has definitely flown by, but one thing that hasn't changed has been your support for the channel. We really couldn't have asked for a better core community, and for that we're extremely grateful, and thank you guys for it. But with that being said, let's hop on over to our stat of the day. Yesterday's stat of the day was just 3 running backs had at least 16 carries in week 1 but posted less than 10 half PPR points. Those players were Najee Harris, James Conner, and which was the third running back. The correct answer was actually Derrick Henry. Congratulations to Dark Eye, the first to get this right on YouTube, and as for Twitter, at WetLikeWalls. Once again, congratulations to both of you. But as for today's stat of the day, which running back was the only running back in week 1 to exceed 4% of their team's air yards? Not only did this running back exceed 4%, they actually finished week 1 with a whopping 12%, 8% higher than the next closest running back. And who was that player? Leave your answer in the comment section down below. We'll be happy to let you know who wins in tomorrow's video. With all that being said though, let's hop right into the first matchup, which is going to be the New Orleans Saints on the road against the Carolina Panthers. This is a game that has quite a low total, coming in at 44 points. The Saints, despite being on the road, are actually going to be coming into this matchup as 3-point favorites, but we can't say that's all that surprising after a really strong week 1 performance, especially at the quarterback position, coming from Jameis Winston, who despite only completing 19 passes, threw for 5 passing touchdowns. Not many of us could have predicted that the Saints would completely blow out the Green Bay Packers, only allowing them to score 3 points, putting up 38 points themselves, so a really strong showing by both the offense and the defense. Heading into this week 2 matchup against the Carolina Panthers though, we can expect this to be a bit of a more difficult defensive draw, a factor we see not only baked into the spread, but also the game total, both being lower than we would expect. For the Saints, Marquez Callaway, the only true wide receiver that we're even considering starting in this matchup. We do have him ranked in flex territory, however on the lower end, just due to Carolina being one of the more difficult passing matchups, putting in a very solid week 1 performance against the wide receiver position in week 1, also dating back to 2020, where they ranked just outside the top 10 at defending opposing wide receivers. As for the Carolina Panthers, they'll also get a much more difficult draw in this week 2 matchup as opposed to the week 1 matchup, so both DJ Moore, Robbie Anderson, they are going to come into this one with a bit of a lower floor. Game script, however, is working in their favor, them being 3-point underdogs at home. I'd still feel more comfortable if I saw a bit more out of Darnold before ranking these wide receivers all that high. This week though, DJ Moore back in wide receiver 2, borderline high in wide receiver 3 though. Robbie Anderson though, we do have ranked lower, clear wide receiver 3 or flex play. That leaves just rookie Terrence Marshall, who's coming off of a 6-target rookie debut. Pretty positive, but that was again against the New York Jets, a much weaker pass defense. His 5 PPR fantasy points that he put up in week 1, even with the same amount of targets against the New Orleans Saints, have much less upside. If you own him, you probably have better options to put in the flex, so just leave him on the bench this week. Up next, we have the Cincinnati Bengals on the road against the Chicago Bears. This is a game that has a 45-point projected total. Bears 2.5-point home favorites, and in this game there are several wide receivers that we could potentially start. Starting with the higher end option, we'll begin with the Chicago side with Allen Robinson. He's coming off of an 11-target performance against a very difficult LA Rams pass defense. While positive to see him get that high target market share with Andy Dalton leading leading at quarterback. The negative matchup just completely diminished any possible results we could have expected from those high targets. Heading into this matchup, though, against the Cincinnati Bengals, it's a very beatable one. In fact, Allen Robinson has a very cake schedule over the next several weeks, so expect A-Rob in his fantasy value to increase from this point forward. So A-Rob owners can not only rest knowing that we have him ranked as a mid-grade wide receiver 2 this week, but that he'll likely at least retain that value, if not increase it over the next few weeks. So lock him in with confidence, and he'll even come with some upside this week. The other Chicago Bears wide receiver, the only one we would consider starting, Darnell Mooney. He's best left on the bench. It's nothing against this matchup. The Minnesota Vikings completely tore up this past defense. They were a beatable defense all last season as well. The only issue is we're just not sure what to expect out of the quarterback position. We really want Justin Fields to begin starting so we can see an increase in overall fantasy output for all the weapons in this offense. At that point, I feel Darnell Mooney will be a more trustable asset. At this point, though, we do have him ranked just outside the top 45 wide receivers, so a desperation flex play for owners who may be dealing with early injuries. Maybe you're in a super deep league, then Darnell Mooney may be a guy that you fit in the flex. Just temper your expectations, though, even in this positive matchup. On the other side of the football for the Cincinnati Bengals, we already know there are 3 wide receivers that we are possibly considering starting. That's T. Higgins, Jamar Chase, Tyler Boyd. We still do have them ranked in the order of T. Higgins, Jamar Chase, followed by Boyd. Chase, though, is definitely creeping up after his debut, coming in with 100 receiving yards, even scoring a receiving touchdown. Far cry different from his subpar preseason debuts. The Chicago Bears are a defense that overall does put fear in some owners when starting opposing players against them, but you definitely shouldn't fear starting wide receivers against them. So both Higgins and Jamar Chase, they are going to be ranking right in that back end wide receiver 2 range. They do, of course, also have upside, being underdogs yet again in this matchup. As for Boyd, though, a bit less bullish on him. He's ranking outside the top 40. A flex player, one that should be considered more of a high floor play as opposed to a high ceiling play, especially with the other weapons, T. Higgins and Jamar Chase providing much more upside than Boyd in his role in the offense. Moving into the next matchup, though, we have the Houston Texans on the road against the Cleveland Browns, coming in as massive underdogs, 13 points. It's actually the biggest spread that we have on the entire week. So the Cleveland Browns being heavy favorites and having a strong run game with Nick Chubb, also having Kareem Hunt to spell carries from Nick Chubb. So there is no overworking this run game, lending the game script heavily in favor of those players, a bit less in favor of Jarvis Landry, who is the only wide receiver that we're really considering starting here with Odell Beckham already ruled out. It's basically pick your poison, though, for the Houston Texans because they have a poor run defense, but also a poor pass defense, allowing rookie Trevor Lawrence to completely pick them apart in week 1. And even dating back to 2020, this was the team that allowed the 7th most fantasy points to the position. For that, Jarvis Landry, he will rank just inside the top 30. Just keep in mind that he is going to be a high floor play, one that also comes into this week with a positive matchup. Just don't be all that surprised if he does put up a disappointing performance. Nothing against Jarvis Landry, it's just that this team can be so easily beaten on the ground, and with having 2 very strong, capable running backs in this backfield, they can easily win this game with just throwing very few pass attempts, and Jarvis Landry being a more high volume receiver that could certainly play against him. On the other side of the ball, we have Brandon Cooks, who really surprised a lot of people in week 1, myself included. I was unsure exactly how he would perform with Tyrod Taylor, but like Brandon Cooks has done throughout his career, he's performed very well regardless of quarterback, and in this positive matchup against the Cleveland Browns, a game where they are nearly 2 touchdown underdogs, the passing volume, the overall potential for targets for Brandon Cooks is going to be much higher than it was in week 1, meaning the potential for a repeat type performance from Brandon Cooks, it's certainly out there. We do have him ranked higher than Jarvis Landry. He is in the wide receiver 3 range, just inside the top 30. In my expectations, I'd be very surprised if he actually does post a dud this week. And speaking of duds, the next matchup is the Indianapolis Colts 3.5 point underdogs against the LA Rams. They are playing at home, though, in a game that has a 48.5 point projected total. The reason I mentioned duds, though, is because Michael Pittman, a player that we've been very high on throughout the offseason, he had a stellar matchup against the Seattle Seahawks subpar secondary last week and really didn't capitalize on it whatsoever. He wasn't even the leading wide receiver for the team. Even with that being known, though, we still do value him as the highest value wide receiver on this team. So when it comes to rankings, you'll notice Michael Pittman is going to be atop all the Indianapolis receivers. That's really not saying much, though, because the Indianapolis receivers are all ranked outside the top 50, meaning don't start any of them. The reason being, they're facing the LA Rams, one of the best pass defenses against wide receivers they have been this season as well as all last year. This matchup isn't even comparable. It's night and day different in difficulty when you compare it to the Seattle Seahawks matchup. So if they struggled in that one, don't expect all that much in this one. Like I mentioned, leave them all on the bench. On the other side of the football, though, Robert Woods, Cooper Kupp, we absolutely adore them. The Indianapolis Colts, yet another team that people are fearful when starting players players against, but the wide receiver position is actually one you do not have to fear. And with this team having a target funnel that heavily favors players like Tyler Higbee, Cooper Kupp, and Robert Woods, all three of them should be excellent starts this week. At this point, from what we've seen from the wide receiver position, though, we do have to give the edge to Cooper Kupp. What he showed in week 1 when it comes to chemistry with Matthew Stafford, the potential he has for upside on a smaller target basis when compared to Robert Woods, a player that typically does require a bit more volume. Those are factors that do push us more on the side of Cooper Kupp. So when it comes to ranking, Kupp is a borderline wide receiver 1. We're talking a ranking of 12 or 13. As for Robert Woods, though, still in the wide receiver 2 range, a back end 1 at that. Definitely one you can continue to consider high floor. I know some of you are probably going to ask, but Van Jefferson is a player that we're leaving on the bench. Yes, he had a very strong week 1 performance, but it's too small of a sample for us to trust. He is worth rostering, though, in deeper leagues or leagues with a more competitive waiver wire or deeper bench. Those are the types of leagues I would still be targeting Van Jefferson, a player that I was personally high on throughout the draft research process. Up next, we have the Jacksonville Jaguars at home against the Denver Broncos. The Broncos, despite being on the road, are coming in as 6-point favorites in a game that does have one of the more lower totals, coming in at 45.5 points. In this one, the Denver Broncos should be able to both run and pass with ease. With Jerry Jeudy, though, now on IR, the target funnel for Courtland Sutton, KJ Hamler, and Tim Patrick, it should shrink up a bit. Noah Fant should also see an uptick in production, but considering this is a wide receiver start and sit video, let's focus more on Courtland Sutton and crew. With Jacksonville being one of the worst pass defenses, it's undeniable that Sutton does have plenty of upside heading into this matchup, but we do have to be reasonable and realistic with our expectations. This is a player coming off of a serious injury. We see players like Saquon Barkley recovering from injury, not feeling like themselves. Courtland Sutton had an uncharacteristically bad performance in week 1. Easily that can be chopped up to the injury, so expecting that to just completely solve and fix itself in week 2 just because Jerry Jeudy isn't there, it was never a target issue. So Courtland Sutton's struggles could be slightly deeper than Jerry Jeudy being on or off the field. So for that, we do have to rank him conservatively, but also fairly. Put him right in the mix of the hat with players like Jarvis Landry, Brandon Cooks. I think that's exactly the type of player and expectations that we should have out of Courtland Sutton. Again, not being disappointed with a dud performance. We know he's recovering from an injury. As for the other players, Tim Patrick, KJ Hamler, I just want to start with KJ Hamler because he's actually a player that I think can be a sneaky start, especially in DFS leagues this week. Season long, I can't recommend going there. It's too boom or bust, high upside, all risk, not so much reward. But in Underdog, in DraftKings, with a salary for a player like KJ Hamler being so low, all he needs is one busted play in order to pay off his draft price. And against the Jacksonville Jaguars pass defense, it's one of the best defenses you could possibly target for a player like KJ Hamler. They do allow big plays. KJ Hamler, a big play specialist, a gifted athlete, but the more reliable asset outside of Courtland Sutton definitely is going to be Tim Patrick. He'll look to soak up most of the consistent production with Jerry Jeudy being out, besides Courtland Sutton, of course. At this point, though, with it being the first game, we still do have to be pretty conservative, even in a positive matchup, so we would prefer you do leave him on the bench. Desperate owners, though, if you do feel the need to start him, just be aware that we do have him ranked outside the top 50, just outside the top 50, so if you start 3 wide receivers, 2 flexes, this could be a range that you would routinely start a player. For most of you out there, though, just leave him on the bench. But with me bringing up Underdog, perfect time to shout out our exclusive offer. $10 deposit gets you $10 to play with. Guys, Underdog, it's a blast. Not only can you play daily fantasy, but you can also take player prop bets, which are some of the most fun things to possibly do as somebody that studies fantasy football, somebody that enjoys that. With us only owning one roster and one team, we're limited to the amount of players that we can really back in any given week, but that's not to say that we're not high on other players across the league and aren't sure that they're going to have really solid games. In fact, no, each and every week, we know players are going to pop off, but on Underdog, we can actually put our money where our mouth is. If that is something that potentially interests you, we have a link for it in the description box below. Just don't forget to use our code FFA at checkout. That's how you're going to nab this deal, so take advantage while the limited supplies last. On the other side of the football for the Jacksonville Jaguars, these are going to be 3 wide receivers in Marvin Jones, Laviska Shenault, and DJ Chark that you can trust virtually each and every week, almost regardless of matchup. We already know that the Jacksonville Jaguars are going to have to be a very heavy passing team. The only downside, though, is just having 3 solid wide receiver options means that depending on which way the coin flips, your players, if you put too much trust in them, they could end up posting a dud in favor of some of the other wide receivers. We can't realistically expect enough garbage time production for all of them to have successful weeks each and every week. One of them is bound to disappoint, and ultimately, it's going to make its rotations. But if we had to rank them, Marvin Jones, the clear lead at this point. Laviska Shenault, the high floor option, we would rank second behind Marvin Jones. And then rounding out the list, probably the high ceiling option coming in with DJ Chark. Fantastic snag you had in week 1. As for the range in which we have them ranked, just consider them wide receiver 4/flex plays. Like I mentioned, Marvin Jones probably the one that has a more balanced approach, a high ceiling, not at an expensive a floor. Laviska Shenault should be looked at more of a high floor play, a player that ranks outside the top 100 when it comes to average depth of target, meaning that if they do struggle against this passing team, meaning if this passing offense does struggle against this defense, Laviska Shenault's likely going to be the outlet that they look for in short routes, lending itself very positively to a player with a higher floor. And DJ Chark, as we know, he's a higher injury risk player that does have the potential to score a touchdown from any area of the field, an upside play, but the way in which he does get his production does lend itself to having a bust or two every now and then. Moving into the next matchup, Buffalo Bills versus the Miami Dolphins. On the Buffalo side of things, let's keep this simple. Stephon Diggs, you already know you're starting him, so the only true question is whether you're going to start Cole Beasley or not. We do have him ranked just inside the top 50, but ideally we would like to start another option. Beasley's floor never being as high as many people like to make it seem in Buffalo. No other wide receiver outside of those two, though, we really should be considering starting, so we'll move right into Miami. Unlike last week against the New England Patriots, this is going to be a much better game script for the receivers, a much better defense to target, especially the ones that run the shorter to more intermediate routes. That's going to be an area that they can target against this defense. Outside wide receivers, they do typically struggle against Buffalo. So while Devontae Parker, typically a player we would rank significantly higher than the rest, in this one we have him ranked back-to-back with Jalen Waddle, both players ranking 43 and 44th alike. Each of those players does have upside in this matchup because they are likely to be playing from behind in the third, in the fourth quarter. They'll be looking to pass the ball. I feel pretty good about both of those wide receivers. The ceiling, you could probably call it into question, but regardless, if you own them, have no fear in starting them this week. Really quickly though, before we do get into the next matchup, just got to shout out our website. If you guys are not members, consider signing up. You get a ton of perks up on your screen. I'll show you a bit of a preview of some of the perks that you will gain by signing up for our in-season package. You'll get access to our private Discord community group. You'll get the rankings, droppable players list, season-long rankings, not to mention even more waiver options, even more trade targets, all updated each and every week. A full preview of what to expect for the upcoming week can be found at the content schedule tab of the website, so if you haven't seen that, definitely check it out to know what you can expect and when you can expect to see it. It's a fantastic deal. It'll fully prepare you for the league, and with this package, you can easily make all the correct decisions without even listening to a single video. We don't want you to stop listening, but with this information, you'll have all you need to have a successful fantasy season. With that being said though, let's hop into the next matchup. It's the New England Patriots against the New York Jets, and on the Jets side of the ball against this Patriots defense, guys, not wasting time here. Don't start anyone. The only one on the New England side actually that's even worth mentioning though, that's going to be Jacoby Myers. The tight end position, Jonnu Smith, that's a different story. I think he draws a great matchup, but this is a wide receiver start and sit video. Jacoby Myers though also draws a phenomenal matchup. We have him ranked as the wide receiver 37 on the week, and definitely one that comes into this week with a bit more upside than he may have in future matchups. Definitely the most that he's had throughout the season so far, the short 2 weeks we've had. We cannot forget this was a player who had double-digit targets in consecutive games. He was the leading receiver for this team. He does have that in the wheelhouse, and against this New York Jets pass defense, it's a very beatable matchup for him, so look for him to capitalize. So if you own him, if you're in a pinch, this would be the week I would suggest starting Jacoby Myers if there ever was one. The next matchup we have is the San Francisco 49ers versus the Philadelphia Eagles. The elephant in the room here is Brandon Ayuk and Deebo Samuel. Don't get me wrong, we were high on Deebo Samuel heading into last week, but that wasn't supposed to be at the detriment or expense of Brandon Ayuk, and with him posting a complete dud, he's lost the faith of many fantasy owners. The season-long outlook for him, it is called into question, so at this point, if we did have to pick one between Deebo Samuel, Brandon Ayuk, we do have to side on the production, and from what we saw from Deebo, he's proven it on the field this season, and Brandon Ayuk, while he did do it last year, he's going to have to gain our trust back. He can start in this matchup, a very beatable matchup for him with the Philadelphia Eagles, a team that allowed the 9th most fantasy points to the wide receiver position last year. In week 1 though, they performed phenomenally against Calvin Ridley and the Atlanta Falcons. I wouldn't expect it to hold back the San Francisco 49ers. Kyle Shanahan, he's really creative. Matt Ryan and the Falcons, their cards were really on full display. Not much hiding what their offense has the capability of doing with such limited playmakers. Either way though, Deebo, we do have him ranked just inside the top 20, actually coming in as the wide receiver 20. Brandon Ayuk though, we can't really trust him as anything more than a flex, so we can't even recommend you starting him as your wide receiver 2 that you drafted him for. If you're desperate, if you're thin, you can put him in the flex, just obviously you know what type of floor you get with him. On the other side of the ball, Devonta Smith, a player we were extremely high on heading into last week with a cupcake matchup against the Atlanta Falcons. He definitely made haste of that defense, breaking out in yet his lone start of the season, his rookie debut, ultimately turning 8 targets into 6 receptions, 71 receiving yards, and even scoring his first NFL touchdown. He'll look to continue that magic, and for that, we have him ranked just outside the top 30, coming in as the wide receiver 32. I wouldn't be surprised if this is a player that in the coming weeks, if he can continue to string together some successful performances, this could be a player that takes a tier jump in the midway part of the season, and by the fantasy playoffs, we could have a player that's an every week start. Unfortunately though, no other Eagles wide receiver or San Francisco wide receiver we're trusting in this matchup, so we're going to move right into the next one. The Las Vegas Raiders versus the Pittsburgh Steelers, and I've been really excited to analyze this one. Not much really needs to be said on the Oakland Raiders side of the ball. For starters, the Pittsburgh defense, it's really strong, and the Oakland Raiders passing options at the wide receiver position, even against softer matchups, they're not even able to be trusted in the flex, at least not consistently. So when it comes to this matchup that is on the more difficult side against the Pittsburgh Steelers, even in a game in which they're projected to be trailing, we can't trust it. We can't recommend starting anyone outside of Waller on the Las Vegas side of the football. But when it comes to Deontay Johnson, Juju Smith-Schuster, as well as Chase Claypool, all 3 wide receivers are definitely in consideration this week. Deontay Johnson far and ahead the leading wide receiver on this team, and you'll be shocked to hear that he received over 60% of his team's expected air yards last week. Expect that trend to continue. Deontay Johnson is a target monster for this offense. He will have better games than he even had in week 1, so start him with confidence. We have him ranked as the wide receiver 16 for the remainder of the season. But with the Las Vegas Raiders defense being so poor against opposing wide receivers, Chase Claypool, Juju Smith-Schuster, they're both ranked as wide receiver 4s or better. Juju Smith-Schuster ranked inside the top 36, Chase Claypool ranked inside the top 30. When it comes to those 2 players though, they could end up being a bit hit or miss depending on the matchup. In this one though, you can start them with confidence. Najee Harris, he has a strong chance to bounce back as well. So if you own a Pittsburgh Steelers player, now is the time to get them in your lineup. Moving into the next matchup, we have the Minnesota Vikings on the road against the Arizona Cardinals. This is a game that has a 50.5 point projected total. Arizona Cardinals, a 4.5 point home favorite. On the Arizona side of the football, DeAndre Hopkins, he is a complete stud. You're going to be starting him each and every week, but in this matchup, he does have even additional upside than he typically wouldn't have in other matchups because the Minnesota Vikings pass defense when it comes to defending opposing wide receivers has been one of the weakest over the past 2 seasons. Last season, they actually ranked across all of 2020 as the 4th worst defense against defending that position. This season, they haven't started off all that good either, allowing Jamar Chase to have a great game, T. Higgins as well. The Arizona Cardinals passing offense does have the potential to be much greater than the Cincinnati pass offense, so if they struggled against Cincinnati, Arizona can completely tear them apart with Kyler Murray. That's not to say that I completely trust any of the other weapons like AJ Green, Rondale Moore. The only wide receiver you could potentially consider flexing is Christian Kirk, who's coming off of a 2 touchdown performance. In fact, between DeAndre Hopkins and Christian Kirk, they're the only 2 wide receivers that were on the same team to have multi-touchdowns, so kudos to them. Don't expect that magic to continue though, but it's definitely in the cards. As I mentioned, Minnesota, terrible passing defense. If Kirk had it in the wheelhouse to do it in week 1 against a slightly stronger pass defense, then heading into week 2 after already being warmed up, already having proven that connection so far this season, Christian Kirk to have yet another good game, it's definitely in the cards, but we can't rank him all that high. We do have him ranked as the wide receiver 50. Certainly a more boomer bust player, but if you're facing a team that has a ton of upside and you just need to throw in players that have the potential to pop off, Christian Kirk definitely fits the bill. On the other side of the ball for the Minnesota Vikings, no real question here. Justin Jefferson, you start him. Yes, he did have a somewhat disappointing game. Adam Thielen, he completely popped off. Don't expect that trend to continue. Justin Jefferson is the one to own in Minnesota from a season-long perspective. It's not to say that Adam Thielen is completely worthless. In fact, both players are not only great starts in this week's matchup, but both rank well within the top 20 for our rest of season rankings. Jefferson inside the top 10, Thielen just inside the top 20. But consider Thielen more of a borderline wide receiver 1 in this matchup, one spot behind Justin Jefferson, who's coming in at the wide receiver 13. We're just going from great matchup to great matchup. The next one we have is the Dallas Cowboys on the road against the LA Chargers. This is a game with one of the highest projected totals, coming in with 55 total points. The spread, pretty darn close. LA Chargers favored by 3 at home. Consider that a wash. The Dallas Cowboys, if they were at home, I'm sure the spread would lean in their direction. And when it comes to the Dallas Cowboys pass defense, last season, they ranked bottom 5 in the league. Started off this year against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, allowing Chris Godwin to just completely pop off. Antonio Brown had a vintage day himself, so who's to say that this defense can do anything to stop Keenan Allen across the middle of the field? Mike Williams potentially as a red zone threat, still a deep threat as well. Both of those wide receivers should be started in all leagues if you own them. Even Mike Williams, a player that you probably drafted later, I would start him over many of the players that you drafted ahead of him. Just keep in mind that when it comes to Mike Williams, the floor for him is always going to be 0. We know he can step out on the field, strain something, wind up on the sideline. That's just some of the risks that you assume with starting Mike Williams, but the upside that you gain in return. Got a glimpse of it last week, scoring over 20 fantasy points. In this matchup, dare I say, the upside for him is even greater. If you don't believe us, check the ranking. We currently have him ranked as the wide receiver 25 this week. Keenan Allen, you already know, he's our wide receiver 5 on the week. You're starting both of them. And on the other side of the football, CeeDee Lamb, Amari Cooper, you don't need me to tell you, you're starting them as well. They're 2 bona fide wide receiver 1s. The matchup for them, it may not be as juicy as it is on the other side of the ball for the Chargers, but with Dak Prescott being the quarterback for this team, I trust him a bit more than Herbert. I wouldn't be surprised whatsoever if we're comparing the production between Mike Williams and Keenan Allen versus Amari Cooper and CeeDee Lamb. I wouldn't be surprised to see the production of Lamb and Cooper to be vastly greater than that out of the LA Chargers, and that's not to throw shade at the Chargers. Like I mentioned, I'm very high on them, but if we're talking ceiling, few receivers have a higher ceiling than those two in this Dallas offense. Moving into the next one, yet another great matchup. Seattle Seahawks at home against the Tennessee Titans. A game with another high projected total, one of the highest on the week, coming in with 54 projected points. Seattle, though, at home, a heavy favorite, coming in at 6.5 points. That is going to lend itself much better to the run game. With that being said, though, Tennessee Titans, they do have one of the worst pass defenses against opposing wide receivers. So even as heavy home favorites, Tyler Lockett, DK Metcalf, they make amazing starts this week. DK Metcalf, in fact, is actually ranked higher than Keenan Allen. As I mentioned, he was ranked as the wide receiver 5. DK Metcalf, he's our wide receiver 4, and in fact, his 60 yards and a touchdown that he put together on 4 receptions last week, if that were to be the output that we got from him in this week, I would actually be disappointed based on my current expectations. As for Tyler Lockett, though, I'm a bit lower on him. I think when this offense can pass with ease, that is going to favor a matchup for DK Metcalf a bit more, but that's not to say Tyler Lockett is destined for a dud. No, in fact, we do have him ranked inside the top 20. As mentioned, one of the better wide receiver matchups you could possibly ask for. So why on earth would we rank Tyler Lockett so low? Yes, he was inconsistent last season, but until he gives us a reason to expect that, we got to give him the benefit of the doubt. And if you're an owner, you can't be benching him after the production he put on the field last week. On the other side of the ball, for the Tennessee Titans, AJ Brown, Julio Jones, they also draw a great matchup. This has shootout potentially written all over it. It's the reason why this has one of the highest projected totals on the week. Yes, the Tennessee Titans offense struggled greatly last week, but they're going to be working all week and have been working all week to correct some of the issues that held them back. They have more offensive firepower than they ever have, and with Ryan Tannehill, we really haven't seen him struggle like he did last week. It's not asking too much to expect a bounce back game out of him, and he hasn't given us a reason to doubt him. AJ Brown, a bona fide wide receiver 1, coming in as the wide receiver 11 this week. Julio Jones, he hasn't really picked up steam yet, and we already know that the volume is going to be a bit lower than what he was receiving in Atlanta, so the ceiling, the floor is also going to be lower. But in this phenomenal matchup in a game that has shootout potential, Julio Jones, he ranks inside the top 30. You'll be best not to rely on him as your wide receiver 2, though. You'll feel much more comfortable relying on him as your wide receiver 3, but definitely one that has the upside to exceed wide receiver 2 value. The next matchup we have, it's a classic matchup, Lamar Jackson versus Patrick Mahomes. We've seen this several times before, and each time it is a great one to watch. In this one, though, for Kansas City, Tyreek Hill is really the only wide receiver that we can trust. Mecole Hardman, he's been a bit disappointing. We do have him listed as a buy low candidate at the wide receiver position, but until he does show us a reason to trust him in our lineups, we can't rank him even in flex conversation. He's outside the top 55, meaning don't consider starting him, and the Baltimore Ravens pass defense, it's been one of the better ones in the league consistently over the past 2 seasons. While Mecole Hardman is a player that's potentially matchup proof, Tyreek Hill himself has already proven to be, we still do have Tyreek ranked as the wide receiver 1 on the week, but Mecole Hardman owners, this is not going to be the one to test him out in your lineup yet again if you started him in week 1. On the other side of the football for the Baltimore Ravens, Marquise Brown, Sammy Watkins, those are going to be the 2 names in the wide receiver hat we're throwing in this week. Just keep in mind, Kansas City, although they're a team with one of the best offenses in the league, and when you think strong offenses, you immediately think shootout, and I brought the word shootout up several times in this video. Kansas City against opposing wide receivers, as we know, is actually a difficult matchup, and with Marquise Brown being a player who's played a bit inconsistently throughout his young career, trusting him in this matchup, that would be a fool's errand. That's not to say you can't start him. We actually have him ranked in starter territory as the wide receiver 39 obviously not ranked high enough in which a dud is going to completely derail our expectations for our roster for the week, but he's also ranked in a range in which you can start him, hope for the best, expect the worst. Those are the types of players that I like to put in my flex spot. I want them to have that upside. I'd much rather have a player that has the potential for a 2-touchdown performance. I'll start that player 10 out of 10 times over a player I know can guarantee me 4 receptions for 30 yards. As for Sammy Watkins, he currently leads all Baltimore wide receivers in receiving yards. This could be considered a revenge game. Sammy Watkins, though, are we trusting him in our lineup against a difficult passing defense? I think not. You have to be pretty desperate or in a very deep league in order to do that, but the revenge narrative, it's held true in many cases, so we can't completely rule it out. Maybe a better underdog type player, but still somebody to keep an eye out on, though. If you own him, I'd recommend leaving him on the bench, and we don't even have him ranked in flex territory. All right, guys, we're moving into the final matchup we have on the week. This is the Monday night matchup. It's the bounce back game for Aaron Rodgers against the Detroit Lions. That's right, the Thanksgiving special. Thanksgiving, though, came 2 months early this season, and with its arrival, Davante Adams, while not ranked as our overall wide receiver 1 on the week, he's still ranked our wide receiver 2. Not a wide receiver 2, but the second overall wide receiver in all of the rankings. What that tells you is that the poor week 1 performance from both Rodgers as well as Davante Adams, we're really not putting all that much weight on it. We've seen a large enough sample between these two players to know exactly what they can produce, and in this matchup against the Detroit Lions, one that they beat on several occasions that really hasn't improved all that much. The offense of the Lions has actually decreased from what it has been in previous seasons as well, so in theory this should be an even softer matchup. Davante Adams should completely crush, but keep an eye out for Marquez Valdes-Scantling. The Detroit Lions allow big plays. Marquez Valdes-Scantling in week 1, despite a poor output from many of the offensive weapons, it was positive to see MVS finish the week as the 6th overall wide receiver in the NFL in the area of percentage of team air yards. Yes, it was a poor performance for the other receivers on this team, but MVS can certainly look to build upon that in week 2. He's a sleeper. Not saying you should start him, but he definitely is worth rostering, and if he has a good game, that would support everything that Aaron Rodgers has said about him throughout this training camp. From what we saw in week 1, MVS could be a sleeper that continues to improve throughout the season and potentially grows into somebody we can trust in the lineup. At this point, though, he's just a flyer in the flex position at best, but you'd have to be pretty desperate to do so because the odds are against him. He is going to be more of a wait and see type player, but if you're in a pinch, if you're thin, maybe you sustain some injuries, putting in MVS could be a high upside option that could win you a week against a tougher opponent. Then lastly, we have the Detroit Lions wide receivers, and fortunately, guys, we do have to end the video off this way, but there just aren't any that we're trusting. The Green Bay Packers pass defense, it is on the better side, but even if it wasn't, even if it was a weaker pass defense, no wide receiver has separated themselves enough for us to trust in our lineups, at least in any reasonable 10, 12 team league, even 14 team league. Yes, a dart throw is always potentially going to work out, but guessing which player is going to work out for, you always have a chance, but until we see it on the field, I'm not personally trusting it. I can't recommend you do either. But guys, that's going to do it for this video. If you enjoyed, definitely hit that like button. Let us know who your top starts of the week are this week. Don't forget, sign up for our in-season package, get access to the Discord, get our week 2 rankings, get our buy lows, our sell highs, get all of it, one low price. And if you enjoyed the video, how about hitting that like button? If you're new to the channel, please hit that subscribe button. Thank you all for watching. Catch you on the next one.